And that's what I like about the idea of an unholy Bible study is we're acknowledging that this book doesn't belong exclusively to the church, that it's part of our cultural inheritance as people living in the 21st century. That anybody can read it, anybody should read it, and decide for themselves what's meaningful and what's not helpful about it. Hi, everybody. My name is Evan.
And my name is Scott.
We are both Baptist pastors, and this is our podcast about the Bible. But wait, don't leave. We're not trying to save your souls. We will not be telling you what to believe or how to behave, and we promise never to invite you to church. We just like to talk about the Bible, what it actually says, where it probably came from, and how it's been understood or not by different people in different times and places. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, and no, this is not a bait and switch. There will never be an altar call or a come to Jesus moment. We are both people of faith, and at this point, we're likely to stay that way. But if you're not, or if you find yourself reimagining your relationship to God, we hope this podcast might be helpful to you. Maybe you are agnostic or atheist or a person of another faith, and you're curious what some Christians believe. Or maybe you're a Christian who wants to know a little bit more about where this book came from and how it came to us. Whoever you are, we hope that you will stick around and listen. But this is your warning, especially if you are or have been a person of faith. For our purposes, the Bible is not a sacred text. During this podcast, we'll be treating the Bible more or less like any other book. We are pulling it down off the pulpit so that we can get real up close and personal with it. While you're here, there is nothing you have to believe. There are no beliefs you can't question, and there are no questions that you can't ask. Welcome to the unHoly Bible Study Podcast. We're here and ready to get started. Scott, this is the first episode of the unHoly Bible Study Podcast. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. We are starting this podcast at the very beginning of the very first book of the Bible. We'll be talking today about the first chapter of the book of Genesis. But before we do that, I wanted us to talk just a little bit more about who we are and what the Bible has meant to us, why we care, and why we wanted to talk about it in the first place. Scott, what are your earliest memories of reading the Bible or knowing about the Bible or the stories?
Well, I grew up in a Baptist church in West Virginia, and the Bible as Baptist, that was central to everything we did. On our communion table, if it wasn't Communion Sunday, it was the Bible on the communion table, so it was always there, always present. And then growing up, as a little child in Sunday school, it was always about the Bible. And even thinking about this passage, that was one of the earliest stories probably ever spoke of. One thing, well, really two things about growing up in my relationship with the Bible. First, because it was so important in our particular faith tradition, memorizing the Bible was like key from early on. Even first grade, you learn, a few verses, and that's a gift to me. All my growing up years exposed to the Bible, memorizing the Bible, and I'm so thankful for that. But one thing about it, growing up, I didn't realize that there were other ways of looking at the Bible than the way my church looked at it.
Yeah, nobody ever mentioned that to me either.
Yeah, and you just assume, this is what Christians think. And then it was really probably started it started before college, probably high school. I'm just a question type person. I want to know everything. I'm curious. And it was then I began to realize maybe this isn't the only way to look at it. And it made me question, why does my church think its way is right as compared to every other way? And so I would say from that point, my journey has been to explore the Bible in any way possible.
I think my early experiences were probably similar. Maybe what I probably remember from my earliest years is not actually reading the Bible out of the book. Like I remember having a physical Bible, like I can picture the first Bible I ever had, like the picture that was on the cover, the way the pages looked and felt. But my first memory of these stories are actually cartoons. I remember my family had like these VHS tapes, and we might have only had one. But it was somebody had done like I think it was a Hanna-Barbera cartoon about the Bible, or telling stories from the Bible, and those are the memories that I remember most clearly. Like those are the images that are totally lodged in my brain.
One thing also about my experience was the interpretive presuppositions within the church that I grew up in, was that the Bible was the inerrant word of God. That was drilled into us.
And that meant like everything in it was perfect and accurate.
And there was a phrase used also, a verbal plenary inspiration, which means literally that God said it and somebody else is copying it. And that was the way it was communicated, and that there are zero mistakes or conflicts or anything within the Bible. Again, like I said, I didn't know there was another way to think about it, so I was just taught.
Yeah, and I just assumed everybody this is just true.
It was a very visual thing to me that Moses, just sat down and God told him exactly what to write for,
Yeah.
And then it became almost preposterous to me later on that that's how it happened.
I also have pretty clear memories of being in middle school and sitting through church services and being probably not any more bored than anyone else was. But I remember my mom wouldn't let me bring a book. Like what I really would have liked to do is be reading a novel or something else during those services. But that was not allowed. Like you had to be there. You could not be tuning it totally out or reading something else during the worship services. But she did not care if I was reading the Bible. Like there was always a Bible in the pew, or I had carried mine with me to church. And it was okay during the sermon to flip through the pages of the scriptures and read like what was actually. And those are some of my earlier memories of the Bible too. Not so much what I was taught about it, but I remember sitting through sermon after sermon, like hours sitting in the pews and flipping through the Bible, kind of going back to those old stories I'd heard and finding them. Like I remember scanning through, looking at the headings, looking for names, like some of those stories I knew where they were, some of them I didn't. And I remember reading like the actual versions, not the Sunday school versions, not the cartoon versions, but how does the Bible actually? And probably my first questions emerged then as I was realizing, well, like there's a lot of stuff here. One, it's much more complicated. It's much more, I would sometimes sit there wondering, like, am I allowed to be reading these words or descriptions of these acts in a church service? Like, I didn't know this stuff was in the Bible. And I certainly didn't know these stories were told that way. It felt so adult. And grown up, and also much less clear and obvious than people had always told me to expect it.
You're talking about much more adult. That brings up a memory for me. I remember seeing my dad's Bible laying on the coffee table or whatever, and I opened it up, and on the first page, my mother had given that Bible to my dad. And she ended the inscription with, I forget the verse in the Song of Solomon, but it said, "Kiss me with the kisses of your mouth." That's what my mom put in my dad's
that's
Bible.
awesome.
So she put that Bible I remember, like, it talks about kissing in the Bible.
Yeah, it's a window into the Bible and into your parents' relationship. Yeah. That's awesome. The other thing I would mention is I was kind of emerging into adulthood, like probably between like the ages of 18 or maybe around the age of 20. I'm still in churches. I'm part of churches. I'm beginning to contemplate seminary at that point, thinking that maybe I'm feeling called to be a pastor, whatever that meant to me at that age. I starting to preach for the first time, like people are inviting me to stand up in front of other Christians and talk about what the Bible means. And I remember how much I learned just from Googling, just looking up these passages or looking for commentary on the internet. Like there's so much there that's terrible, and I would be scared to send someone to the internet to find accurate information about the Bible. But at the same time, that's where early on I learned about the documentary hypothesis, like the idea that more than one person wrote many of the stories that we've heard, or that the Old Testament wasn't just Moses sitting down and writing it. It was cobbled together over hundreds or thousands of years from oral traditions and different stories knit together. The internet taught me that. It was the internet where I first read like militant black theology. Like I had read James Cone before I ever went to seminary or grad school and started having these more academic conversations about the Bible. And I think that was a really important step in my journey, is that information was out there and accessible. And even before I'd gotten to grad school and started learning from professors, I had some inkling of this wider world and these other perspectives on the Bible that no one had ever told as I was.
You're speaking, I'm like, wow, Evan's a lot younger than I am, because when I was growing up, I didn't have the internet. I can't imagine what would have happened if I had something like that to explore the questions I had.
Do you think it would have been helpful?
I certainly would have, because I'm so curious, I certainly would have scoured the internet. But again, because there weren't those kind of resources, I just assume everybody thought the way that I was taught.
Yeah. I would assume when you got to grad school or maybe college or started seminary, I assume some of those questions you'd had were validated by professors. Did you get answers to the hard questions you'd been asking, or did it just raise more questions?
My experience in seminary, it wasn't answer-oriented, it was question-oriented. Many of my professors, I felt like their goal was to get me to ask to get all the students to ask the kind of questions that are troubling to the soul, that drive you to explore. It's, the classes are so inside. I remember students weeping in some of my class, getting tears in their eyes because their views of Scripture were being challenged. For me, it was like, oh, wow, this is fun, but it was traumatic for some folks.
Yeah.
Thinking about our audience, we're not going to know who's watching, what your background is, whatever. But one thing in talking about this is the unholy Bible study. I know people who have seen the way the church has handled the Bible, see it almost as silly the way it's been handled, almost see it as comical that we don't use our rational minds in the way we interpret it. And I just want to invite, anybody watching us on this first episode, we want to approach those questions that you likely have, especially for those who've never been a part of a church. We want to approach the Bible, these stories, these chapters, in a way that is objective, that respects those kinds of questions.
But I did want to ask about your experience as a pastor. I know that's kind of, that's been our life experience, but I know most people listening to this are not pastors, have not studied the Bible. And I'd be curious what you've seen as a pastor. What do people tell you about their relationship to the Bible? How do people seem to either approach it, or why do they stop reading it? Can you think of any stories or any who's shared with you what the Bible means?
Yeah, there was a point, maybe 10, 15 years into my life as a pastor, where I mustered the courage to introduce some of the questions and that I got to explore in seminary. And what I discovered when I started to do that is people would come up to me, often privately, because I think they had this nervousness, insecurity within them that they've never asked these questions before, dared to ask them publicly. But they would come to me and say, wow, I've never heard a pastor say the kinds of, almost like it's a relief to give permission to people. That's the observation I saw in my own career as a pastor. And I really wanted to give people the freedom to explore. That was important to me.
Yeah, that word freedom feels really important. I think I've seen the same thing, that most people don't feel any freedom to read the Bible for themselves. I actually had a church member tell me this year, we were talking about the idea that anyone can read these stories or read the words from the Bible and interpret them themselves. And someone came up to me after that Sunday service, and no one has ever told me before that I'm free to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've seen that countless times. If you're raised in the church or even kind of adjacent to the church, maybe you've read some stories from the Bible, but probably all you know about it is what someone told you it says or what they told you it means. And it seems, I know for a lot of people, it causes anxiety. They have questions, but they don't feel. And I do think that's one of the reasons we wanted to make this podcast, is to encourage people, to give people permission if they need it. Not that they need permission from us, but to let people know they're not the only ones who have questions. And the book is right there. Mm-hmm. Like, they can go themselves and read it. And people have dedicated their lives to studying what this book means, where it comes from, and how it can be or should be or shouldn't be understood.
You know, there was a mantra I grew up with, and the mantra was, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That was the approach we had to the Bible.
And like every word in every one of those sentences is wrong.
Uh-huh. And that just seemed weird to me. I mean, truly, that, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. It's like there's no room for anybody to think about anything. You just take it literally. There really aren't any questions you should ask.
Yeah, it's literally a way to end the conversation before it even began. Mm-hmm. We have called this the Unholy Bible Study Podcast, and I want to talk at least a little bit about that word. Why is it unholy?
Let's start with the holy part. I think the whole language of holy, the Holy Bible, the sacred scriptures, that implies clearly that it's the domain of the church to handle this book, right? That somehow the church has the authority to explain and interpret this. But this idea of holy and unholy, and it's actually a biblical concept, in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, there are these two concepts, holy, or the sacred, and then the profane. And profane doesn't mean like evil or bad or anything like that, but it simply means for common or secular use. So take a cup, and that cup's used in the service of the temple. That cup is consecrated. It's a holy cup. But if you use that very same cup in your home, its use is profane, common, secular. And I think it's important to treat the Bible, if you're going to try to make it relevant or invite people who aren't religious to think about it, we ought to take it out of that environment where it seems like the church is the sole arbiter of what it means. And let's be honest, objective. And to me, that's what it means for me.
Yeah. We do use that word holy to describe the Bible as people of faith. And I think I still use that word. I think it's an important idea that these scriptures for Christians are holy. They are set apart. They are helpful in a way that other books aren't for Christians. We use them in worship. But I also find maybe because of that, I think Christians also kind of handle them with kid gloves or are hesitant to ask any questions. Sometimes leaders or churches take advantage of that, and they cultivate that sense of fear and reverence. You can't ask questions of the Bible. It is so holy that you need to be afraid of it. Like you hear that sometimes, or you know that that's how people have been taught to think about the Bible. And I also think it just makes that holiness makes Christians really defensive sometimes, and Christians of all kinds, not just super conservative, evangelical or Orthodox Christians, but I think lots of the people I know that I went to school with still feel really defensive when the Bible is questioned or when someone starts to interpret the Bible from outside of the church. And that's what I like about the idea of an unholy Bible study is we're acknowledging that this book doesn't belong exclusively to the church, that it's part of our cultural inheritance as people living in the 21st century, that anybody can read it, anybody should read it, and decide for themselves what's meaningful and what's not helpful about it.
Well, and in all honesty, also, the unholy Bible study is intentionally provocative. It may be disturbing to folks in the church to hear we're doing an unholy Bible study, but I think that might be an entree into the folks we're really hoping will listen.
Yeah, I think it's a cool name.
Yeah.
And I hope it's also a name that works. Today we are diving in and talking about the very first chapter in the Hebrew Scriptures. If anybody doesn't know, the Christian Bible is usually divided into two parts, usually labeled the Old Testament and the New Testament, at least when Christians read it. And we're looking today at the Old Testament, the very first chapter from the book of Genesis. This is one of the older parts of the Bible. These stories were originally written in Hebrew. They are also part of the sacred scriptures of the Jewish people, and that's really where they began. And what we're looking at today is the creation story, not just the beginning of the Bible, but the beginning of all things. Where did life and the world around us come from? These texts were written probably at least 500, maybe 1,000 or more years BCE, kind of before the life of Jesus and the beginning of the Christian movement. So they're very old. They emerged from ancient Mesopotamia, what we now think of as the Middle East. And we'll be talking about what they share in common, how they are influenced or were influenced by that culture in which they emerged, and also what made them unique and distinctive. So when we come back, we will start looking more closely at the text. We'll kind of go through it a section at a time and talk about what's interesting to us about it, what we've learned about it, and how it's been understood by different people through the years. Scott, before we jump into it, is there anything we have to know to understand what's going on in this chapter?
Definitely. So growing up, with that idea that the Bible's just verbally dictated by God, it makes it sound like there are no other documents that exist, But the truth is, that there were creation stories in other cultures and nations at the same time that this one came into being. And for me personally, you cannot even begin to think about and understand what this account of creation meant, its significance, if you don't also consider the environment it was written in. That there is actually a dialogue, a conversation between the Hebrew account of creation that we have in the Old Testament and these other ones. It's clearly a response. And if you don't even know that, I don't think you can begin to appreciate what it's saying.
Yeah. And the book of Genesis is a long book and an old book. If you haven't read it before or aren't familiar with it, it tells the story generally of the origins of the people of Israel, the Jewish people. It will kind of go on to tell about Abraham, who is the founding figure of Judaism, and then it tells the stories of the first few generations of his families. We call these the patriarchs, the sons who would go on to become the tribes, who would become the people of Israel. And most of the book of Genesis tells that story, the story of Abraham and his family. But before that, you have like 10 or 11 chapters of what's sometimes called the primeval history, which is mostly legends that share a lot in common with other stories we know were circulating at that time. So just like you said, there are other creation stories in ancient Mesopotamia. There are other stories. Another important story from that part of the Bible is Noah's Ark. That's one that a lot of people have heard. It's often the first story people hear, which is terrifying in its own way. But we know that story of a great flood that decimates the whole world. Other versions of that story. So the book of Genesis begins with these kind of legendary stories that come out of a time before recorded history and tell kind of where we came from, who were the first people, who were our ancestors, and how did we get to where.
And that word legend, that would have been anathema in the church I grew up in. You couldn't even use that word to describe anything about the Bible.
I think that would have been true in my churches too. I do think the churches I grew up in treated this like history, maybe not, at least in my experience, not history like other history. Like there were some questions we could ask, but then there was always a point at which the questions had to stop. It's like there was, you could ask whether it meant 7 literal days when we talked about the creation of the world, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But you couldn't ask about whether God really created it by hand or whether the world came together in some other way. We know these stories were probably written between 1000 and 2000 BCE, or not written, but started to be told then. They probably began as oral traditions, just stories that were told around the campfire or that were passed down from one generation to the next long before they were actually written down and found the form that's included in the Hebrew scriptures or that we have access.
And one way we can be pretty sure these were oral stories first is the way they are captured in writing in the Bible. In the original languages, it sounds like a story, which it would have been easy to memorize, right? You can imagine the elders telling these stories. And in this one, the word "and" is used constantly. And God did this, and God did that. That's a very oral construction.
So let's jump in, and we'll kind of take this chapter a section at a time and talk about what's there, what it says, and what we notice or what feels notable about it. The first chapter of the book of Genesis begins with a really famous phrase, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." it says, it talks about what the world or the universe was like before God started creating, what was there. And then the very first thing God does is create light. That's the first. God speaks the words, "Let there be light." And that's the first act of creation. What do you notice about this, Scott?
Well, first of all, what just struck me is the earth is the first thing created, or the earth exists already before creation begins. That's a fascinating concept to me. And I bet you folks out there in our audience read that and wonder how they deal with that. We know that's not how it happened. So that's one thing. I think another important thing about this story is even the way that God has talked about it. The word for God in Hebrew is aloha, and in this particular passage, all the way through, actually, in the Old Testament, God is often referred to as Elohim, which is the plural form. Yeah. That's a very striking thing.
Yeah. There is, I think the first thing worth mentioning, or one of the first things, most important thing, is this story seems to assume that there's only one God, a complicated God, a God that we refer to using the plural form of the word. But creation starts with just one God, taking what's already there, which is not what lots of Christians are taught. Christians are often taught that there was literally nothing until God created something out of nothing, which is not quite what this story says. But in this story, it is very clear that it's one God doing all of this, responsible for all of this, which would have been a lot different than what everyone else believed. Like that's one of the unique
often
things.
In the other creation stories of the time, you had multiple gods involved in the creation. I think of the Babylonian creation story, and creation is the result of two gods at war. And two gods are Tiamat and Marduk. And I think it's Marduk who kills Tiamat, and then Marduk cuts Tiamat in half, and part of the half becomes the heavens, another part becomes the land of the earth.
Fairly disgusting.
And then I think the blood becomes the waters or something like that.
Yeah. And they're not the only two gods, right?
So there's many, yeah.
This is this story's emerging at kind of the height of that Babylonian civilization. Some people have heard of Hammurabi and his law code. And this is a largely, it's an advanced civilization. It's a highly developed civilization. And their religion is polytheistic. Like it's a big pantheon. There are lots of gods. There's the big ones, Tiamat and Marduk, one of whom survives the creation story. But then the universe is just full of gods and goddesses and deities, both major and minor. And religious life for a lot of these people is trying to figure out which god is angry.
Which is hard to figure out, right?
Yeah, when there's that many. Like it's kind of a chaotic way to think about spirituality or the supernatural. There's so many gods to keep happy or to not offend or bother, and they can all affect your life. They can all affect the weather, the way things happen to you, how your business is going, what's going on with your family, whether you have a family. And religion, for a lot of people in this time or in this culture, is trying to appease some or all of the gods, right?
Isn't it bizarre that the story of creation for that environment was this warring gods approach? I mean, can you imagine what the people, how they even looked at creation if it's the result of this violence?
Yeah, it's such a chaotic story. It's a violent story, and it suggests kind of a chaotic worldview behind it. Which makes sense. Like there's a lot of evidence for chaos in the world around us. And I think that's one of the things that really stands out about this whole chapter is in a culture where most people thought of the supernatural or gods or religious life as just the the chaotic behind the scenes of our chaotic everyday life. The story from Genesis 1 is of a very ordered creation. There's one God that's responsible for all of this. And then we'll kind of see it goes through one step at a time, very orderly. God starts with light, and that becomes kind of the canvas on which God continues to create, or out of which God continues. We know that probably the faith of Abraham, the faith that becomes Judaism, probably did represent something totally new when it first started to take shape. This idea that there was only one God was unique, was an innovation, and really did change the way people approached their religious lives. Is there anything else from this first section? Scott, I know you love this metaphor of God hovering over the waters before creation. Mm-hmm. What is it about that metaphor?
Well, so the way it starts, we're told that there's this formless void and darkness. The idea actually between those words, it's speaking of a chaotic mess, that there's this desolate nothingness, this empty wasteland. That's the language being talked about. So that's God's beginning point, this expansive waste.
Yeah, so there's something there, but not.
Right. And then it says that the part you mentioned, that God hovers or broods over the face of the deep, that the idea of the deep, the waters, is also associated with chaos in those cultures. Because if you think of the vast oceans, vast bodies of water, I mean, storms roll in. It's just an obvious metaphor for chaos. So this is what's there, and then we're told God is hovering or brooding over the face of the deep. And that word brooding it's simply the word used in the ancient world for birds sitting on nests.
Yeah.
That's what the word means. It's brooding is about gentleness. It's about being protective of what you're sitting on, constantly watching, protecting. There's a tenderness, a maternal quality to this word. And also this idea that the end of the brooding process is life. Okay? We have chickens. And when a chicken is sitting on a nest to hatch eggs, they go into this state called broodiness.
They're very calm, very...
They sit there for days, glassy-eyed. There's nothing else that exists in the world. And they will forego food and water and relieving themselves for days. When they do that, they go out, gobble a bunch of food, drink a bunch of water, do their business, go back in and sit for more days. If you try to interrupt this process, like if I open the door and the chicken thinks that I'm invading her personal space,
still very calm,
she screams and she puffs up. Get out of here. She's protecting her eggs and I'm a threat. And it is threatening, but it's all about hatching these eggs. And it's so fascinating to me that this creation story is using the metaphor of a bird sitting on the nest, that the God of this creation story is more like a bird than the gods of ancient Babylonia. It is a bizarre, I mean...
God isn't described at all as far as like, does God have a body? Where is God standing? What is God like? Like there's no direct description, but you do have these hints and this kind of metaphor behind the verbs and the text that God...
Yeah, and it's the spirit, whatever that is of God, is hovering over all this chaos and hatching something.
like a single-minded chicken.
Committed to it, passionately committed. Leave me alone. I'm busy hatching eggs.
Right. I would also mention that this is how the Bible begins. Like, there is no introduction. These are the sacred scriptures, but it doesn't say that. It just launches straight into the story. And you only know it's the Bible because someone has told you that. Like, it doesn't say these are holy scriptures and and every word contained in this book is true, and anything we add to it later is true and has to be followed. Like, it literally begins with kind of a once upon a time, in the beginning, this is what happened. And
no
it just
author
goes.
is identified,
No, it's just
Genesis written by.
So at the beginning, God has created light, and then God, it says that's the first day. The light and the darkness are separated, and then the chapter continues, and we find out what God did on the other days of creation. Again, it's a very orderly account. And in these next few verses, kind of verses 6 through 19 of Genesis chapter 1, God has created light, and now God turns and starts creating the structures of creation, the world, the landscapes around us. What do we notice here, or what do we like about this?
One of my favorite things is the way each day ends. He does the thing on whatever day, and then it says, and God said, it is good.
It's good. Yeah.
It's good. Every day God says that. And that word good in the Hebrew language, it's goodness in a multiple shades of meaning. It can mean goodness in terms of aesthetic qualities, beauty. It can mean good in terms of ethical qualities or practical qualities, like this is a good hammer because it's very practical, well-made, whatever. But in this context, it's clearly mostly this aesthetic observation of God. This is beautiful. This is exactly what I imagined. This is perfect. It's just like a work of art.
Yeah.
That's what's being conveyed here.
Yeah. And it's being conveyed in this very rhythmic, almost poetic, like it's not quite a poem, but just like you were saying, this feels like you can imagine this beginning as an oral tradition, like a story that's told because there's a rhythm to it. And each day ends, and there was evening and there was morning, like the sun is setting, and God is calling these things as they're created. God is saying that it's good. This refrain.
First day, and it was good. Second day, and it was good. Clearly good parentheses around this description of each day.
Yeah. It describes things like God separating the waters. So those waters that were chaos in the first few verses of this chapter, now God is kind of gathering them up and putting them in their places. God's separating them into the waters above and the waters below. That's a line that's confused people for thousands of years. God is kind of pushing some of the waters back so that they're into the seas. God's creating dry land between the oceans and things like that. And one of the things worth mentioning, a lot of people look at this and you'll kind of hear it's easy to make fun of this and to say, oh, because the sky is blue, they thought water was up there.
And every once in a while it leaks, right?
Yeah.
And we get rain.
Yeah, there clearly is water up there because sometimes it comes down. But it's so easy to make fun of that, to laugh at that, to say like how silly these cultures were for telling these stories, or how silly Christians still are for believing them. But it's worth mentioning that this is how everybody thought about the universe at this time and place. And it isn't that crazy. Like, there is obviously water up there. Sometimes it rains. You have to make sense out of your world in whatever way you can. And this Mesopotamian civilization was incredibly advanced, was hundreds or even thousands of years old. They had fairly advanced math and science. And this is how the smartest people in the world at this time thought about the universe. They thought about it as the waters above and the waters below, as kind of multiple levels of creation. And we live here in the middle between the heavens above us, which are full of gods and goddesses, the stars and sun and the moon, and the unseen world below us, which is still kind of that chaos.
That had to make
creation.
them nervous, right? They can't see below the surface and what's going on down there?
There's something down there, we know. Like if somebody goes down there, they don't come back.
Every once in a while, a volcano erupts, something's going on. There must be a god down under there that's like mad. Yeah.
So it's easy to imagine why this way of thinking about the world makes sense. And it's easy to imagine God creating it, putting these structures into place and organizing the world into a form that we might not understand everything about, but at least it makes sense to us. God creates all these structures, the landscapes around us, kind of the geography is in place. And then in the section that follows this, we're looking at verses 20 through 30 of chapter 1. God begins to fill the landscapes with life. It feels like the goal God has been working toward all along, kind of the climax of the story. And God starts, well, where does God start? Not with the big stuff, right? But with
you got the land and the seas and the fishies and the plants and the animals. I might not have them all in the right order, but yeah.
Yeah, like the swarms come first, like these oceans. God's made the oceans and then lets them get filled with fish.
Let's fill it with these creatures, yeah.
All the swarming things underneath, the birds that are flying in the sky. Sea monsters, the big fish, the big things that live in the ocean, and the little ones, the creeping things on the ground. God's creating all this stuff in the oceans and then on the land and saying, go, do your thing, be fruitful and multiply. That's a line that's repeated multiple times, kind of a new refrain being added to the text. God is creating life and filling this brand new creation.
And then God created human beings. That's
what it says. It's kind of the climax of this section.
The pinnacle of creation.
Some people would say that. And it gets pride of place in this chapter, right? Like it feels like the whole thing has been building toward all the little stuff that doesn't matter that much. The creeping things, the swarming things, the things too countless to mention, the animals that fill the land, and then human beings. God creates them, and we want to talk about that. That deserves a lot of attention and has gotten a lot of attention down.
Well, and before we get to that, just think about this. Did cows write their own creation story? Did dogs write their own creation? We're the only creatures that even pondered. Well, the only creatures that could ponder these things. So that naturally begs the question, what are we and why are we here? And why are we so different than the other creatures?
Yeah, that seems to be the question. This one of the questions this story is trying to answer, not just where did all of this come, but why are we in particular? And well, what does it say? It says this story has an answer, right? It says God created human beings and they're different. How are they different than everything else?
Well, the most important thing in this account is human beings are created in the image of God.
Right.
So this story is saying that in some way human beings are particularly connected to God. There's something so unique about us, so different than everything else, that it has to be some reflection of the divine.
Yeah, I think this phrase has gotten so much attention through the years. It says God created them in the image of God, but it doesn't say exactly what that means. And certainly everybody has their own idea, but that's not said about anything else in the story. Only human beings are made in the image of God, at least according to this. Some people have said that means that human beings are supposed to be in charge. That we're the leaders or the masters of creation. It's been people have taken that idea and run with it.
Well, it shows up in this story, right? Subdue the earth, right? God says to the human beings. And that can sound so violent, so power-oriented.
Yeah, I think that is at least one of the things this story is saying. So
maybe that's answering the question. We have as human beings, these ancient people, we have an ability to manipulate things on the earth that no other creatures do, and maybe that's our job, to organize, make more stuff, whatever.
Yeah. Well, the only thing we've seen God do at this point, the only image we have of God, if we're reading from the beginning to this point, is God creates.
Mm-hmm.
So there is, I think, some sense that being made in the image of God means that human beings are also creators. Like we take what's there and make something new out of it. And definitely that would be, anybody would look at creation and say, this is one way human beings are a little bit different than the things that creep on the ground or fly through the air. We're the ones who take creation and make something out of it, for better or worse.
Yeah, I can almost imagine some ancient soul sitting on a rock or a log without having any resources to understand and just so puzzled by what exists, recognizing, well, I am kind of different to these other, how do you begin to explain all that from that ancient perspective?
And you mentioned this already, but certainly it says God created humankind in God's own image, and then said, it says God blessed them. God told them what God had said to everyone else. All the other creatures, God had said, be fruitful and multiply. God says that to the people as well. God created men and women, says, fill the earth. And you mentioned this already, says, subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So part of being made in the image of God does seem to be being put in charge.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the story says, is God made human beings and then put them in charge of everything else. It's an idea that has a really complicated history, and one that, looking back from the 21st century, might raise some questions about, is this really a helpful way to think about humanity and our role in the world?
Well, I would say not.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think this passage, first of all, it could never speak to our modern world. It couldn't imagine our modern world. But our version of subduing the earth today, which a lot of it's happening, is ruining creation. And I can't imagine that that's what was being talked about here. But if we take it out of context and say, well, God told us to do all this stuff, then it can lead to, I would say, an abuse of creation.
Yeah. And I'm not totally sure it is out of context. I do think the context matters a lot. But I think the most straightforward reading is also kind of the most arrogant one.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that human beings looking at themselves thinking, oh, I'm different than the dogs. I'm different than the cows. I'm different than everything else I see in creation. I must be like God.
We can build things. We gather our animals together and put them in pens, and we grow food. No other animals that organized or can manipulate creation like that.
Yeah, we're so much smarter. We're so much more powerful. And And yeah, the context is really helpful because I mean, this is an Iron Age culture. They have like stone plows, and the tools they have, they can't imagine the things we would do to the environment today. But the logic is the same. This idea that we must be like gods since we're different than everything else, and we can do whatever we want. That idea has had really harmful consequences. A lot of people, though, go back to this phrase, this idea that we're made in the image of God, and they find something really helpful. Because it doesn't just say that some people were made in the image of God. It doesn't just say that men were made in the image of God, although lots of people have read it that way. It doesn't say wealthy people or kings or royalty were made in the image of God. It's the idea that every human being carries the image. And certainly that has been an important idea in movements for human rights, in kind of movements in the 21st century to recognize the dignity and the worth of all kinds of people of different gender expressions, sexualities. That feels like an important contribution that this text makes to our
it's a given, right?
Conversation.
It's a given. All human beings, right, are created in the image of God, period. And if that's true, if that's our faith, you can't not look at any other human being and begin there. And if you don't begin with that assumption, I think you're on the wrong track.
In this passage, you also have God talking to God. You've got like this conversation happening within the divine mind or something. The language is a little bit confusing. It's translated correctly into the English. It says, God says, let us make humankind in our own image. So it's plural verbs, and the pronouns are correct. God speaking as if to someone else, or to God's own self as if God is more than one thing. Christians centuries later would look back on this and read Trinitarian theology into it. This idea that God is both singular and plural at the same time. Probably that's not what's going on in the original text. Right. This is maybe God using the royal we.
Which was a convention in those times. Gods always referred to themselves in the plural.
Some scholars have also seen this as kind of a relic of an older way of thinking about God as just one God out of many, kind of in that pantheon we've talked about. Or maybe this is God addressing everyone else in the heavenly court, like God is surrounded by the angels and the powers and all the supernatural beings that we assume populate our world, and God is kind of speaking to them and saying, let's make human beings a little bit like us, a little bit special, a little bit different than everything else in the world. One thing we haven't talked about is the fact that this is only one of two creation stories that are included here at the beginning of the book of Genesis. And a lot of people have probably heard these stories before, but they might not have noticed that there are two of them or the ways that they are different. And we won't go into a lot of depth about the second chapter of Genesis today. The story of Adam and Eve is told in Genesis chapter 2. But I would mention that there is absolutely no mention of sin or of any problem in this creation that God made. God goes from the beginning to the end of creation, one day after another, and there's no fall, there's no sin, there's no disruption in this world that God made. It's all good, right?
Mm-hmm. And one thing I want to get back to is that last day, the seventh day, when God takes a day off. I've always taught this is the first labor law in the Bible and maybe human history, which If you think about the Jewish people, the ancient Israelites, they begin as slaves, no days off, no rest. It was brutal oppression. And this is actually that day off idea is elevating humanity, saying there needs to be some dignity in the way we treat each other, and to give a day off is a very important way of showing that dignity.
Yeah, so God's doing all of this one day at a time, right? Each day, God is creating something new. God's stepping back saying, yeah, this is great. We can draw the curtain on this day. There's evening, there's morning, and then there's another day. God creates human beings on the sixth day. And then this last section of the chapter, on the seventh day, God rests. That's what it says.
Yeah, he's watching the NFL and eating his snacks and falling asleep on the couch, right?
Maybe that's what it means to be made in the image of God, just sleeping on the couch. There's this sense, this is one of the reasons that scholars have identified this chapter with what's called the priestly source. If you've ever studied the Bible and heard someone talk about P, scholars often say that P probably wrote or that this story came from P, which is the priests of ancient Israel. You can kind of feel, as you read this text, it feels like something you would hear or something you would say in church. It feels more like the Bible than it feels like a story. And it also emphasizes at the very end, the whole story kind of builds toward the creation of human beings and the institution of the Sabbath, this day of rest, which becomes one of the most important laws that the people of ancient Israel followed. Is there anything else you want to highlight, or anything else we've noticed or think is worth sharing about this chapter?
Not at the moment, but one thing that strikes me is I bet there are questions out there that we haven't anticipated. And it would be fascinating to hear some of those questions, what our audience has heard about this story, what they think about it. One thing I'm sure a lot of folks out there have heard is this whole idea of a literal 6-day creation. And there's a lot of churches passionately committed to that way of looking at it. It's interesting, this whole debate about the number of days and the way and the manner really didn't begin until the beginning of the scientific revolution. You think about Darwin, and when Darwin started to present this evolutionary theory, that's when the church got really committed to these ideas, because those other ideas seem so contrary to what we see in the Bible. And so the scientific revolution created this need to defend these texts in that way.
Yeah, for most of Christian history, this idea that creation happened in 6 days wasn't like a hill to die on, right? And wasn't the most important thing about this story. Nick, is that something you heard?
Yeah, and that was one of the questions I think I had for my dad it was like,
when you were a kid.
Yeah, did Jesus actually walk on water? Did God actually make the universe in 6 days, or the earth in 6 days? And because it was kind of, to me, it was like, okay, I don't really see how all of this magical stuff would have been possible back then, but like it's not happening still. Like why would that be possible back then? But like now it's like you can't even conceptualize how that's possible. So
yeah, it feels like a different world, doesn't it? Like they're not describing something.
Yeah, it just feels like story time.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I can't imagine what it looks like to somebody out there that's not part of the church to hear some segments of the church be willing to die on this hill. And I bet it seems silly. It seems silly to me, actually, I know that might offend some of my brothers and sisters within the Christian faith, but I mean, to like make this so central, yeah.
And you can still find, it's pretty incredible how many authors are still writing, how many blog posts you can find. Like, it is not at all difficult to find people who read these stories as literal descriptions of the physical universe in which we still live. We're still insisting that, well, there must be water up there somewhere because Genesis says that God separated the waters above from the water below.
Well, and again, I want our audience to know there are pastors like us who are willing to look at this in a completely different way, to allow those questions, to not see a necessary conflict between science and faith.
And I think there always have been in most traditions. The point of the story is who did it, not how it. So, Scott, one of the things we want to do each time we're together for each episode is to think about further reading. If people are interested in these ideas or these topics, where are they explored more? Is there contemporary culture? Are there books or pieces of art or movies that might pick up these same themes? Does something come to mind for you when you think about Genesis 1?
Yeah, actually, I don't know if I can't remember if this book specifically talks about creation, but it's a book called The Shack. And God is portrayed as a black woman in this book, which I find so fascinating because it actually, the way that the story is told about God from this perspective, it sounds so much like God has given this personality, and so that would be a book for me. Maybe not dealing specifically with this text, but
yeah. Have you read Christina Cleveland? God is a Black Woman. Yeah, she picks up or comes at the same idea in some really meaningful ways, I think. I did not think of a book. I figure we've read enough. So for further watching, I actually thought of an old movie. I think the first or maybe the second Star Trek movie I ever saw, which is Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. If this is a movie you've seen before, it is all about, like, it's exploring the themes of creation and destruction. Genesis gets name dropped in this movie. It is absolutely not a subtle movie at all. It is over the top in a lot of ways. There's a little bit of Bible. There's a little bit of Moby Dick thrown into it. Ricardo Montalban is just like chewing up the scenery. But at the center of this story is the creation of technology that allows human beings to create, but at the very same time can be used to destroy or requires whatever was there before to be wiped out or destroyed. And I think it actually does a pretty good job of exploring that theme and our responsibility as human beings. The responsibility we have to take seriously given how quickly technology both to either participate in the creation and the protection of the world around us, or destroy it if we're not careful. So if that's a movie you've seen before, go back and watch it. If it's one you're interested in, it's a good place to keep thinking about these themes. And if it's not, I won't be offended.
Well, now it's time for my favorite part. Take it or leave it.
Yes. So the wrap up for each conversation will be a game we call Take It or Leave It. And the rules are simple. We've talked about a chapter from the Bible, and now we have to decide whether we will take it with us. Is there anything helpful here, anything that informs the practice of our faith or our lives as we seek to live good ones, or do we leave it behind? There's nothing here that's really helpful. The only catch is that you have to pick one or the other. You can't carve it into pieces. If you take it, you have to take the whole thing. If you leave it, you leave the whole thing behind. So for you, Scott,
Well,
right
this
now,
is definitely a take it.
you like this?
I love this story. I feel like there's so much in it, a richness in it, that for me communicates the God that I believe in. The whole gentle, nurturing, loving God that creates beauty. I love that. It's a message I could preach forever.
I'm also a take it for this chapter. I have questions. I'm not sure that this idea of the image of God is all that helpful. I really can't stand the language of dominion and control, this idea that human beings can do whatever they want with impunity.
But you're not
the
carving
text
those
has
out,
been
right?
Used,
You're not breaking
really
the rules,
clearly.
are you?
But if I've got to pick one, you got to keep a creation story, and I like this one better than the next one. So no, if I've got to pick, take it or leave it, I'll take this one too. I think that about does it.
This
I
was
think
fun.
we have finished our conversation, said everything we wanted to say. We would love to hear any questions you all have, or things you noticed in this chapter or would like to hear someone talk about. But as we wrap up, we do want to say thank you to Nick Mandog Smith for producing and editing this show. We want to say a special thank you to Jay Kennedy, our executive producer. I want to thank the congregation of First Baptist Church of Indianapolis, where I serve as one of the pastors. I know that a lot of my colleagues would hesitate before doing something like this or speaking totally freely about the scripture, but I'm grateful for the freedom I've always felt as a pastor at First Baptist to share accurate information and acknowledge some harder questions about the Bible. Scott, anyone you want to thank?
I do. I have such ambivalent feelings about the religious environment I grew up in and have departed, from some of the things I was taught. But there is one thing precious to me that my church gave me growing up, and that was memorizing the scriptures, knowing the scriptures. Even though I may interpret it differently now, that is such a gift that I have that deep inside that, that's a gift. And I thank them for that.
It is a special thing. We also want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us. Please remember to rate and review and subscribe. That means a lot to us. If you do have questions, you can email us at unholybiblestudypodcast@gmail.com. If there's a chapter from the Bible you'd like to hear us talk about, you could also email us there. If you hate this show and everything we've talked about and think that God hates it too, you don't need to email. Next week, we will be back at the same time talking about what?
Another creation story, a third one in the New Testament. The Gospel of John, chapter 1. It starts with, in the beginning.
We're starting at the beginning again.
All over again.
We hope you will join us. Thank you so much for being with us today. And until then, see what you can accomplish in the next 7 days.